She was the most famous voice in the world, and she was terrified. Not of the crowd, not of the cameras, not of the music. She was terrified of the sky, of leaving the ground, of stepping onto a plane and trusting that the world beneath her feet would still be there when she landed. And for a woman whose voice had conquered every continent, that fear was about to cost her everything. That woman was Agnetha Fältskog, and this is the story nobody told you. Before we go any further, think about this for a moment. You are one of the most recognized voices on the planet. Millions of people know your name. Stadiums fill just to hear you sing. And yet, every single time you have to board a plane, something inside you goes cold. Your hands shake, your breath shortens. The world outside the window looks less like freedom and more like danger. What would you do? Would you hide it? Would you push through it? Or would it slowly, quietly, begin to unravel everything you had built? Agnetha Fältskog was born on April 5th, 1950, in Jönköping, Sweden. A small town, a quiet childhood, a girl who sang before she could properly write. By the time she was 17, she had already written and recorded her first single. Not because someone discovered her, not because a label came knocking, but because the music inside her had nowhere else to go. She was not the kind of person who chased fame. Fame found her. And when it did, she accepted it the way you accept something you didn't ask for but cannot refuse. Gracefully, quietly, with a smile that always looked slightly like it was hiding something. When ABBA formed, when Waterloo shook Brighton, when the world opened its arms to 4 Swedes in sequined costumes, Agnetha was already carrying something heavy. A daughter she had left at home, a marriage that was quietly bending under the weight of ambition, and a fear, growing slowly in the background, that the higher they flew, the harder the fall would be. But no one saw it yet, because on stage, Agnetha was luminous. She moved like she belonged there. She sang like every word cost her something real. And the world just called it talent. It wasn't only talent, it was survival. By 1976, ABBA was everywhere. Dancing Queen had reached #1 across Europe. America had opened its doors. Japan had lost its mind entirely. Fans waiting at airports, police cordons, cars changed for security. The band was no longer just successful. They were a phenomenon, a force of nature. And forces of nature don't get to be afraid. But Agnetha was afraid, every single day. The tours were relentless, city after city, country after country, flight after flight. And each time she boarded a plane, something inside her grew a little smaller, a little more fragile. She never spoke about it publicly. She smiled for the cameras. She sang for the crowds. And then she went back to her hotel room and wrote letters to her daughter Linda, who was growing up at home without her mother. This is the part of fame nobody photographs. The quiet cost. The thing you give up that nobody applauds you for giving. Agnetha gave up ordinary mornings. She gave up school plays and bedtime stories. She gave up the small, unremarkable moments that turn out, years later, to be the ones you miss the most. And still, she kept flying, because ABBA needed her, because the music needed her, because when you are part of something that big, your fear becomes a private matter, something you carry alone, in the window seat, at 30,000 feet. But something was about to change, and when it did, it would change everything. The year was 1979, and ABBA was at war with itself. Not openly, not loudly. The war ABBA fought was the quiet kind, the kind that happens in hotel corridors and recording booths and the long silences between people who used to finish each other's sentences. Bjorn and Agnetha had separated the year before. They were divorced now, but still performing together, still singing love songs into the same microphone, still smiling for the same cameras. Think about what that means for a moment. Every night, Agnetha stood on a stage and sang about love with the man she had loved and lost. Every night she looked into the crowd and gave them something she no longer had. That takes a particular kind of strength, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that looks, from the outside, exactly like professional. But beneath that professionalism, something was fracturing. The tours had become longer, the flights had become more frequent, and Agnetha's fear of flying, which had always been there, quietly, privately, was now growing into something she could no longer contain. She had developed what doctors would later describe as a severe anxiety disorder. Not just nervousness, not just discomfort, a genuine, physical, overwhelming response to the act of leaving the ground. And here is what made it worse. She couldn't say it. Not to the press, not to the fans, barely even to the people closest to her. Because when you are Agnetha Fältskog, when you are the voice of the most famous band on the planet, you are not supposed to be afraid of anything. You are supposed to be fearless, luminous, untouchable. She was none of those things in private. She was a woman who gripped the armrest until her knuckles went white, a woman who counted the minutes until landing, a woman who, on certain tours, could not sleep the night before a flight, and arrived at the airport hollow-eyed and silent, while everyone around her assumed she was simply tired. On stage, she gave everything. Off stage, she was disappearing. But then, in 1979, something happened that changed the calculation entirely. ABBA was scheduled for a major international tour, flights across multiple continents, dozens of cities, months away from home. And Agnetha, for the first time, began to seriously consider whether she could do it. Not whether she wanted to. She had long since stopped asking herself that question, but whether she physically, emotionally, could. She had a daughter at home. Linda was 9 years old. Every flight Agnetha took felt like a gamble. Every takeoff felt like a moment where she might not come back. And the thought of not coming back, of Linda growing up without her, had become something she could no longer push aside. So she made a decision. Quietly, without announcement, without drama. She told the people around her that she needed to reduce the flying, that the tours needed to be restructured, that there were limits, and she had reached them. The world didn't know, the fans didn't know, but inside ABBA, everyone knew. And no one quite knew what to do about it. Because you cannot run the biggest band in the world on reduced flying. And you cannot ask Agnetha Fältskog to choose between her fear and her career without understanding that for her, the fear was never really about the plane. It was about what she might lose if the plane went down, and what she had already lost by being on so many planes for so many years. This is the moment the story shifts, because what happened next, nobody saw coming. There is a recording session that ABBA insiders have spoken about in hushed tones for decades. It happened in Stockholm, in the winter of 1979. The studio was warm. Outside, Sweden was frozen. And inside that room, 4 people were trying to make music while carrying the weight of everything they were not saying to each other. Benny was at the piano. Bjorn had his notebook. The engineers were at the console. And Agnetha, Agnetha was standing at the microphone, looking through the glass at a room full of people, and feeling entirely alone. The song they were recording that day was not one of their famous ones. It was a deep cut, a quiet piece, the kind of song that doesn't make the headlines but stays with you for years. And as Agnetha began to sing, something in the room shifted. The engineers looked at each other. Benny's hands slowed on the keys. Bjorn put down his pen, because what was coming through that microphone was not a performance. It was something closer to a confession. Every word Agnetha sang that day carried the weight of everything she had been carrying alone. The fear, the loneliness, the exhaustion of being luminous for a world that never asked how she was doing, the grief of a marriage that had ended in the most public way possible, and then continued, professionally, as if nothing had happened. When the take ended, nobody spoke for a long time. Then one of the engineers said, quietly, that he had never heard anything like it. And nobody disagreed. This is what people miss when they talk about ABBA's music. They talk about the melodies, the production, the harmonies. But the reason those songs last, the reason they still make people stop whatever they are doing and just listen, is because they were made by people who were actually living the things they were singing about. Agnetha was not performing heartbreak. She was reporting it, in real time, through a microphone, into a machine that would preserve it forever. And outside, the world kept turning. The fans kept buying records. The radio stations kept playing Dancing Queen. Nobody knew that the voice behind those songs was quietly trying to figure out how much longer she could do this. By 1980, the decision had been made. Not officially, not with an announcement, but quietly, in the way that all the most important decisions are made. Agnetha had begun to pull back. She was doing fewer interviews, spending more time at home, letting the distance between herself and the band grow, not dramatically, but steadily, like a tide going out. Benny and Annie Fried had also separated by this point. The two couples that had formed the emotional core of ABBA were both gone now. What remained was four people, who still made extraordinary music together, but who were increasingly living in separate worlds. The Visitors album was recorded in this atmosphere, and, if you listen to it carefully, you can hear it. There is something different in those songs, a weightiness, a sense of finality, as if the people making the music knew, even if they never said it out loud, that this was the last thing they would make together. Agnetha's voice on The Visitors is unlike anything she had recorded before. It is quieter, more interior, less concerned with being beautiful, and more concerned with being true. She sounds like someone who has stopped performing and started simply speaking. And then, almost without anyone noticing, it was over. The last time ABBA recorded together was in 1982. There was no farewell session, no final toast, no moment where someone said, "This is the last time." They simply finished what they were working on, and then they stopped. Agnetha went home to her house outside Stockholm, to Linda, to the quiet she had been craving for years, to mornings without airports, to evenings without stages, to a life that was entirely, finally, hers. And for a while, it was enough. But here is what nobody tells you about the silence after the storm. It is not peaceful, not at first. When you have spent a decade being one of the most recognized voices in the world, and then suddenly you are not, the quiet doesn't feel like rest. It feels like disappearance. Like you have stepped off a stage and walked into a room where nobody can see you. Agnetha struggled with that disappearance more than she ever admitted publicly. She had left ABBA, or ABBA had left itself, and now she was just a woman in a house outside Stockholm, with a daughter who was growing up, and a silence that pressed in from all sides. She tried solo work. She made albums. Some of them were beautiful. Some of them did well. But none of them felt like ABBA. None of them had that particular electricity that happens when four specific people make music together. And Agnetha knew it. She didn't say it, but she knew. The years passed. The world kept asking, will ABBA come back? And Agnetha kept saying, politely, clearly, no. Not because she didn't miss it, but because going back would mean getting on planes again. It would mean airports and hotels and stages and the relentless machinery of being famous. And she had worked too hard, paid too high a price, to go back to that. She retreated further. By the late 1980s, she was living almost entirely out of the public eye, rarely seen, rarely photographed. The woman who had once been one of the most photographed people on the planet had simply vanished. The tabloids called it eccentric. They called it a breakdown. They called it strange. What it actually was a person who had spent a decade giving everything she had and needed the rest of her life to get some of it back. Wait, don't miss this detail. In 1983, just 1 year after ABBA's final recording, Agnetha was involved in a car accident that left her shaken and withdrawn. It was not widely reported, but people close to her say it deepened her retreat from public life significantly. The woman who was already pulling back pulled back further, and the silence around her became something almost absolute. But here is what the silence couldn't touch: the music. Because while Agnetha was disappearing, ABBA's music was doing the opposite. It was spreading, growing, finding new listeners in new countries, in new generations. Dancing Queen was playing at weddings. The Winner Takes It All was playing at funerals. Mamma Mia was playing on radios in countries ABBA had never even toured. The band had stopped, but the music had not gotten the message. And then, decades later, something happened that nobody expected. In 2021, Agnetha Fältskog walked back into a recording studio. Not alone. With Bjorn. With Benny. With Annie Fried. For the first time in nearly 40 years, the four of them were in the same room, making music together. She had gotten on a plane to get there. Nobody made a big deal of it, but those who knew her knew what it cost her. And those who know the story understand that when Agnetha Fältskog boards a plane, it means that whatever is waiting on the other side is worth it. The Voyage album was released in October 2021. It reached #1 in multiple countries. Critics called it a miracle. Fans called it a gift. And Agnetha, in a rare interview, said simply that it had felt natural. As if the years between hadn't happened. As if the music had been waiting, patiently, for all of them to come back to it. She was right. The music had been waiting. It always had been. Because some voices don't belong to one decade. Some voices don't belong to one band, or one marriage, or one fear conquered or not conquered. Some voices belong to something larger than all of that. Something that doesn't end when the tour ends, or when the marriage ends, or when the plane lands and the door opens and you walk back into your quiet life and try to remember who you were before all of this began. Agnetha Fältskog's voice is one of those voices. It was never just about ABBA. It was never just about Eurovision or Dancing Queen or the sequined costumes or the screaming crowds. It was about something underneath all of that, something true, something that fear and fame and 40 years of silence could not touch. The stage lights may have gone out, but the voice is still ringing. And somewhere outside Stockholm, in a quiet house, a woman who was once terrified of the sky knows exactly what that means.